Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody. I am so pleased to introduce our two speakers today, Erica Marin-Spiata, who is an associate professor of geography at the University of Wisconsin, where she studies topics related to biogeography and biogeochemistry, and is also involved in other projects that are related to ethics and harassment and other climate workforce issues. Joining her is Meredith Hastings, who is a associate professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Brown University, and she is, by way of her training, an atmospheric scientist. And so together, Erica and Meredith are going to sort of have a tag team sort of presentation and are going to discuss with you all the important topic of how we can prevent bullying and harassment in the field. So Erica and Meredith, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Next, please. So we're very excited to talk to you today. Meredith and I are part of a team of scientists and educators leading the ADVANCEGeo Partnership, which is funded by the National Science Foundation Advanced Program. And we're focusing on empowering geoscientists to transform workplace climate. A few of the goals of the project are to collect data on workplace environment in the geosciences. We're developing bystander intervention training with scenarios that are relevant to geoscientists' experience every day in the lab, in the field, and in conferences, and that also incorporate intersectionality, or the idea that groups with different identities that are marginalized experience more or are more vulnerable to experience different types of hostile behaviors in the geosciences and in academia more generally. We're also developing teaching modules that identify harassment as research misconduct and partnering with professional societies to develop a sustainable model that can be transferred to other disciplines. And we're working very closely with American Geophysical Union, the Association for Women Geoscientists, and the Earth Science Women's Network. Next, please. So today we have a little bit of time to talk to you about some important topics, and actually following up on some of the conversation on the last webinar on field safety. We're going to focus on talking about how to address, prevent, and respond to bullying and sexual harassment during field training or field research environments. And so first thing we want to do is make sure everybody recognizes the problem, and we'll show you some data on prevalence. We'll define these behaviors and ask you to think about what these might look like. We'll identify challenges unique to fieldwork environments. We'll identify elements of effective codes of conduct as one important strategy to try to reduce the prevalence of these types of behaviors, and then also have a good plan in place, if these behaviors do happen, how to address them. And then we'll go into discussing some real-world scenarios. And finally, we'll share additional resources and open it up to any questions people have. But we also encourage you to use the chat, the chat section of the presentation to provide feedback and ask questions. And we'll also be asking you to answer questions as we go along the way and try to make it as interactive as we can, given the format. Next, please. So we're focusing on the geosciences because it's our discipline, but also it's one of the least diverse fields in STEM. Despite decades of efforts to try to increase diversity in the geosciences, we haven't been very successful. Women faculty still make up only 20% of faculty in geoscience departments across the country. And we have seen a bit of increase in the representation of women in the last 10 years. But it's mostly been white women. Next, please. If we look at the representation of women of color, they're in the single digits. 7% of geoscience faculty across the US are represented by women of color. So this means that a lot of departments will have maybe one or two women. In most departments, we'll have no women or men of color. Next, please. And there's a recent study that came out focusing on the geosciences that, again, despite efforts to try to increase diversity in the field, we really have seen no progress in the last 40 years. And there's been a lot of research from sociology and within the sciences to try to understand, what leads to low numbers of diversity. And we're going to focus on some exclusionary behaviors and hostile behaviors that really affect everybody, but disproportionately impact groups that are already marginalized and isolated. Next, please. So just for context, a little bit of data. 62% of higher ed employees in the United States reported witnessing or experiencing bullying in the past 18 months. And this is compared to 50% across the American workforce, so higher numbers in academia. Women make up 2/3 of the targets of bullying. Other groups such as Hispanics and African Americans make up 1/3. So we start seeing some groups being more vulnerable to these types of behaviors. Across higher ed, across undergrads, grad students, postdocs, faculty, and staff, 50 to 60% of women experience sexual harassment. And this is data that was compiled by a recent report from the National Academy of Sciences that came out last summer. We have some data from one of the organizations that Meredith and I are involved in, and over half of our members had experienced sexual harassment during their work experience. A recent survey from field workers reported that 64% experienced sexual harassment in the field, so that's relevant to today's conversation. 26% experienced sexual assault while in the field, and 80% of the women who experienced assault were student trainees. And there is data, of course, sexual harassment, of course, also affects men and disproportionately affects transgender people as well. But for students and for women especially, most of the people experiencing sexual harassment in this field survey were trainees, and most of the unwanted contact came from their superiors rather than their peers. So we start seeing here some potential power differentials affecting these experiences. Next, please. So let's go into some definitions. So what is harassment more broadly? Sexual harassment is a type of harassment. And in the United States, harassment is a form of employment discrimination that violates Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and Title IX of the Education Amendments. And it's defined as unwelcome conduct based on a number of protected classes. And it's unlawful in the workplace when enduring the offensive conduct is a condition of continued employment or learning, or the conduct is severe or pervasive enough that it creates intimidating, hostile, or abusive environments. And then for bullying, and the challenge with bullying is that we know it's extremely prevalent, and there's actually only one state in the United States that has laws legally banning bullying. And the American Geophysical Union's new Ethics Code of Conduct actually defines bullying as the use of force, threat, or coercion to abuse, intimidate, or aggressively dominate others in the professional environment that involves a real power imbalance, but equally important, a perceived power imbalance. And we'll talk more about this power imbalance. Next slide, please. I have a quote here from a recent study that was looking at qualitative experiences of fieldwork. We would do these really, really long days, but we wouldn't be warned when they were coming. They would just happen, and so I wouldn't bring enough food. And I would try to vocalize, I'm tired, I can't go any further, I need to eat. The second time I spoke up, there were other two girls who were quick to say, yeah, we've been out a really long time, it's 8 p.m., let's go eat. We started getting snide comments like, oh, well, the ladies are hungry, so I guess we have to leave. Next, please. So I want us to think a little bit, that scenario obviously described a particular experience, but if you could use the chat window, please type in what different types of behaviors you would identify as bullying. So I'll start us off. shouting at someone would be an example of a bullying behavior. Insulting, yeah. Any other examples of bullying behaviors that you might have observed or you might have experienced? Intimidating, yeah. And these could be, right, physical intimidation or verbal intimidation, put downs, leaving out decisions or decision processes, absolutely. A couple of other thoughts. Excluding, yeah, physically or verbally, yeah. Belittling, absolutely. Great. Next slide, please. So yeah, those are all great examples of bullying, and I have a few other here. Right, refusing to eat with you or the group because you're a woman or women are present. Yeah, so isolation as well. So assigning demeaning work are other types of bullying behaviors. Being treated differently, being the target of unwanted practical jokes and ridicule, being sworn at, right, shouted at, humiliated. Misuse of power or authority, very common. Spreading malicious rumors, gossip, or innuendo. Right, we already had humiliation and belittlement. Also bullying, withholding information or resources needed for people to successfully conduct their work. And you can think about how this might play out in the field too. Exclusion or isolation, and then violence, whether it's verbal or physical. Great. And we're going to talk about sexual harassment. Next slide, please. So also using that chat, please identify, different types of behaviors that you might recognize as sexual harassment, whether they're, verbal or nonverbal or actually physical. So I'll get us started. Leering is one example. Yeah, calling out weaknesses specific to being a woman, comments about a woman's body, positive or negative, dirty jokes, absolutely. Any other examples of sexual? A lot of those are examples of verbal harassment. Yeah, sexual innuendo. What might be some nonverbal or physical examples of sexual harassment? Yeah, physical touching of parts of your body that shouldn't be touched in the public, excluding someone. Yeah, absolutely. Great. Next slide, please. Thanks for sharing those. So here's a list. This is from the Marine Corps Equal Employment Office, Opportunity Office, of different types of sexual harassment. So showing sexually explicit pictures or cartoons, making suggestive gestures, repeatedly asking for dates and not taking a no for an answer, right? Asking somebody for a date once is not sexual harassment, but if they tell you no and you keep asking and, it creates a hostile work environment, and that's definitely sexual harassment. Suggestive sounds or whistling, taking photos of people without their consent, yeah, absolutely. And then there's a lot of physical too, right? Even just invading somebody's personal space a little too close, or just physical, unwanted physical touching of a sexual nature. Great, thank you. Next, please. So psychologists actually recognize that sexual harassment is a lot broader than what most people recognize, and this figures from the National Academy of Sciences report that came out last summer. And psychologists use this tripartite model of sexual harassment. At the very top, we have the tip of the iceberg. This is sexual coercion. This is like the Harvey Weinberg type of harassment, right? Promising professional rewards in return for sexual favors, threats, or bribes. This sounds very egregious, and it's usually what hits the news, but researchers suggest is probably the least common, even though it's what we hear about mostly in the news. Then below that, kind of above the water and starting to go underneath the water here, if we use this iceberg analogy, we have unwanted sexual attention, This is unwanted advances or groping, inappropriate comments or stares, repeated non-reciprocal requests for a date or sex. And then at the bottom in the murky waters is what a lot of people don't actually recognize as sexual harassment, because it's not necessarily sexual in nature, but it's gender harassment. And this is conduct that denigrates or shows hostility because of somebody's gender. These could be offensive remarks or images, gender slurs, sabotage of somebody's work. Somebody mentioned calling out weaknesses specific to being a woman. And this gender harassment is what is least reported, least identified as sexual harassment, and researchers suggest is actually the most common. And really, if we think about, these are things that might happen every day to a lot of people, and we kind of, blow them off or just kind of move on. But these small things are really what kind of buoy the rest of the iceberg. So only the tip of the iceberg is typically reported, but we have to realize that these behaviors create hostile environments more broadly. Next, please. And research and even our work as part of ADVANCEGeo recognizes that bullying and sexual or other types of harassment don't happen in a vacuum. And environments that allow for these types of behaviors to persist also allow for other exclusionary behaviors such as bias, overt discrimination, micro and not so macroaggressions, disrespect, denigration, incivility, bullying, intimidation, harassment, sexism, racism, ableism. And when we think about, let's try to reduce sexual harassment in our environment, or let's try to reduce bullying, we really need to think about, let's reduce all of these types of exclusionary behaviors, because ultimately they violate workplace norms for mutual respect, in many cases are illegal, but they also create a hostile and unsafe work and learning environments, especially in the field. So a question about ableism is basically discrimination on people based on ability. So for example, assuming that people, have particular types of ability when they might not. So it's kind of a discrimination based on ability. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, next slide. So how do we start addressing some of these behaviors? And one of the challenges, I mentioned power imbalances earlier, and one of the challenges is that in the sciences especially, we have this archaic medieval model of mentorship, where we have a student or a mentee that depends on one person for access to funding, access to specialized equipment, access to field sites. And so we have to think about, especially in field environments, but also in the lab, how do we safeguard against these power differentials that are inherent in our system, and how do we protect people from abuses of power? Next slide, please. We also have to recognize that our academic institutions and the practice of science currently is basically, the formation, or has these historical legacies of exclusion. And so we have to constantly work against our practices, structures, and behaviors that were built to exclude people from these institutions. And how do we recognize that, and how do we actually make our environments more inclusive of different people's perspectives and contributions to science? Next slide, please. And this is especially poignant when we think about fieldwork and how, for example, women were actually excluded from field research and fieldwork until in some fields until pretty recently. So think about, how inclusive are our fieldwork practices? How inclusive is the language that we use to talk about our fieldwork? So now I want to talk about some of the unique challenges of fieldwork on the next slide, please. So I'd like to hear from you, what are some unique challenges of fieldwork that might make some of these behaviors that we've talked about more prevalent? Isolation, yeah. Especially in remote areas. Any other examples? Lack of private quarters. Yep. We often don't have our own privacy or space. Yeah. Where do you go to the bathroom? Look at this picture. This is one of my field sites. Where do you go to the bathroom here? There are no trees to hide behind. Absolutely. Erasure of work-life separation. Yeah. You know, you're in the lab, at the end of the day, you go home and you can leave your work behind you. If you're in the field, you're going home with the people you've spent the day in the field with, right? And you might still actually be doing sample preparation. Communal living, absolutely. Physical abilities are compared. Yeah, great. Next slide, please. We'll look at a few other examples. Yeah, some of these I've already mentioned. Sometimes in the field, existing power dynamics are kind of blurred because everybody's kind of working side by side and working together. And so it might be hard to remember that there actually are real power dynamics. And sometimes they can even be more severe because one person has access to the keys to the truck or the satellite phone, right? Some of these we've already talked about, right? In addition, we have to talk about exposure to harsh conditions or hazards, unfamiliar risks. If we're in a new field site, we're usually exhausted, right, from physically strenuous work. We might be in the field just for a few days and not have and be under pressure. Unknown policies, right? What happens if something happens in the field? You know, if you're with people from other institutions, where do you go? What's the chain of command? Unfamiliar cultural norms or language, and also exclusionary local practices. Next, please. And we can think about, you know, how may individuals that already feel isolated and marginalized be affected by these types of behaviors. So I have a quote here from a blog, Camping While Black. As a woman, I'm often fearful about doing certain things alone, and I take as many precautions as I can. However, as a Black woman, I have yet another set of circumstances to consider. I have to reconcile that as much as I love being in nature and seeing the world, there are those who wholeheartedly believe someone like me has no right to be there simply because I am Black. Next, please. So we have some data from a survey of the astronomy community revealing that 40% of women of color reported feeling unsafe in the workplace because of their gender or sex. 28% of them reported feeling unsafe because of their race. 18% reported skipping professional events, including fieldwork. So thinking about how does identity affect vulnerability and the ability to contribute to fieldwork experiences. Next, please. And this is obviously especially relevant in our field that has such low diversity. Next, please. In addition to recognizing the prevalence of harassment and assault in the field, what Kate Clancy's et al. Study of field experiences also highlighted in the box here is that very few people actually were aware of what to do, where to report, and how to protect themselves after experiencing these types of behaviors. And so we really need to think about when we're sending our teams, we're sending our courses into the field, you know, are we prepared to respond to crises? Do they know what to do? Next, please. Another quote from that field survey. The head of the site would systematically prey on women. I was in my bed one time and he was with a married master student and she was basically just crying. And she had to leave the site because he was seducing her and she couldn't say no. I had to serve as a kind of a bodyguard for some of these women. And some of them would sleep on the floor at night because they were afraid he was going to come into the room at night. Next, please. And so this particular paper, and I have a link there, I recommend you all read it afterwards, recognized different characteristics of field environments where these types of behaviors were more prevalent, and identified that incidences of sexual harassment more often were associated with environments where rules and behavioral standards were not clearly codified and consequences for misconduct were not enforced. So there's this stoplight image here where, you know, sites where people have good fieldwork experiences in the green have rules and consequences present and communicated. Yellow field sites, rules are nominally present, but consequences are absent. And red field sites where people experience more exclusionary behaviors are where both the rules and consequences are absent. So this brings us to our next slide, to thinking about how do we prepare for the field. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about codes of conduct. So next, please, thinking about what makes for an effective code of conduct. Identifies and defines appropriate and inappropriate behaviors, goes beyond the ethical treatment of data to include the treatment of people. And this is pretty new in the sciences, and this actually follows AGU's new ethics policy, which defines discrimination, harassment, and bullying as scientific misconduct. Because for too often, for too long, we've thought about ethics dealing with how we treat data, and we really need to think about, how are we treating our people who are contributing to the generation of data. And this is especially important in every environment, but especially in environments with unique challenges like the field. An effective code of conduct needs to clearly specify reporting and investigative processes. It has to outline disciplinary actions for conduct violations. Having rules in place is not enough. There have to be known consequences. We don't recommend zero tolerance policies. We recommend flexibility in disciplinary actions to deal with different types of environments. And I'm happy to answer more questions about that later. It should also include protection against retaliation and has built-in mechanisms for reevaluating. Did this code of conduct actually work once we were in the field? Did it help us, did it help us deal with everything that came up? And if it didn't, then we need to revise it. And very importantly, it's not good enough to have a written code of conduct, on your computer or on a website. It has to be clearly communicated and visible to all participants in the field. Next, please. And for the field especially, we also need to think about, how do we protect people in the field, protect their safety when something happens to them. We have to be able to allow them to continue their field work with minimal disruption. In the past, often people who would get harassed or assaulted or bullied, we would send them home, and that actually punishes them for the behavior that they've experienced. And we also need to protect their privacy as much as possible, which can be challenging in the field with some of the conditions we've already talked about. We always have to have an out. All field workers must have access to transportation and communication devices whenever possible, with no gatekeepers, and have multiple resources and avenues to contact help available for all involved. And also encourage bystander intervention and reporting. And on our website of the Advanced Geo, we actually have some great examples of codes of conduct for field stations or field teams, and 2 examples here from the Keck Geology Consortium and the University of Alaska Fairbanks that I recommend you take a look at. Next slide, please. So now I want to spend a little bit of time kind of going through some scenarios. And I'll have some questions for you to think about, how you would address these scenarios happening in the field. And then also really importantly, how do we prevent these from happening in the first place, right? What do we have to set up in place before we go into the field to make sure these scenarios don't happen? And I'll mention that all of these are real world scenarios. Yeah, I'll ask if there's any questions on what has been presented so far. Thanks, Meredith.
If you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself as well.
Yeah. And I'll make sure to leave time at the end for questions as well. Okay, so we'll move on to the scenarios. And I'm going to ask you also to either use the chat box or unmute yourself and discuss these scenarios with us. So the first scenario, next slide. Inclement weather has limited the number of days available for sampling at remote field sites, causing a last-minute change of plans. The team leader pushes for long days in the field. When the most junior member of the crew asks about stopping to replenish water and eat, Several others loudly complain about them slowing down the team and start making comments about their physical ability. I have some discussion questions on the next slide. So think about what power dynamics might be at play in this situation. How would you respond to this if you were in the field? What could you do in the moment? And then think about, what do you need to have in place ahead of time to support everybody affected in this scenario? And what can you do to prevent these types of scenarios from happening? And I'll open it up for you for discussion.
Hello, Melissa Lafreniere here. Just in response to the what you can do to prevent this scenario, I think exactly this type of thing that we're doing right now is just making people aware that this is just an awareness that this is not an acceptable conduct in the field, and that, you know, everything is, whether it's safety or other concerns in the field, everything basically boils down to you have to go at the pace of the, you know, whoever's the slowest, and it might be the slowest one day is someone else for one reason, and the next day it's someone because they had an injury or whatnot. But I think it's just being aware that we have to, in a team situation, you have to go at the speed of the least able person.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Melissa. Anybody else?
I think something to note here too is that it really is about leadership. And I think if the leader of the team is cognizant, or in a situation like this where this suddenly happens, if the leader of the team really says, yep, this is a great time to take a break, right? Or if you can, as a leader of the team, make an effort to have some breaks already planned or something like that, so that people don't feel like they necessarily have to be the one to raise their hand and say, I really am not comfortable continuing. And I found myself in leading teams in the field that it's really critical, and that if I'm the one who suggests that we all take a break, it seems like everybody is relaxed about it, and it's not this kind of situation where the person who's requesting to take a break is being isolated or being put on the spot or being made fun of.
Yeah, I concur, and again, prevention, have rules established, standard start time, standard end time, scheduled breaks, make it clear that people can get water or take a break whenever they feel the need. Again, put the rules up front so nobody has to shake up the apple cart.
I think this is Phoebe Cohen, I think another suggestion, just thinking about the fact that like the work does need to get done in a limited time, is like having a conversation as a group about, does it make sense for us to break up before this issue happens, right? So like having a group conversation about, okay, these are the things that we need to achieve, how can we do that, and again, having the leader make it clear that it isn't about whether or not someone is better than someone else. It's just sort of acknowledging that different people have different strengths, and that, we're working as a group. I think that's a trickier conversation to have, but I think that there are ways to make everyone feel like they're all working towards the same goal, even if they're not all doing the same task.
Yeah, those are all really great suggestions. And one other idea I was thinking too, and actually if you go back thinking about that quote that I read earlier, one of the challenges in this situation is that people weren't prepared ahead of time for long days, right? And so if you have to do a long day ahead of time and you plan it, then you can make sure you bring extra water and extra food, and also that you have scheduled breaks. But definitely, preparation, obviously before you go into the field, but if you have to change plans in the field, a little bit of preparation and conversation ahead of time goes a really long way in making sure we don't have unsafe conditions. Yeah, those are all great suggestions, and definitely talking about this, right? And not letting it go. But anybody else want to add? Yeah, okay, perhaps having a group meetings at or before the fieldwork begins to hash this out, daily meetings, check-ins, absolutely. Keep checking in with your team. Let's move on to one more. And thanks everybody for contributing. Okay, so field camp. A field course is camping in a wilderness area. As the camp awakens, a female student is seen coming out of the closed tent of the male instructor. Some discussion questions on the next slide. What power dynamics are at play here? What could you do in this scenario? What do you need to have in place to support all those affected? And what can you do to prevent this scenario from occurring? Open it up for discussion. This is a tougher one.
I think partly here too, if you start with kind of, what would you do in the position that you're in now? So, and then consider, what you would want others who have witnessed this as part of your team, what would you like them to do? And do you have mechanisms in place for them to report, this type of situation? And how do you feel that it affects your ability to have the field course run successfully?
I think one thing in this is also that the power dynamic can be viewed in a lot of different ways, whether it's the student coming out of the instructor tent or the other folks that may view themselves at a disadvantage because that relationship has been established.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you definitely have many people affected in this, right? People who would observe this as well. Any other thoughts? What would you do if this happened to you? If you were on this field course?
I mean, as a faculty member now, I would go talk to the student and make sure that the student was okay.
Yeah.
How to have that conversation is difficult because you don't want to make assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
But I would just try to present myself as someone sort of open and neutral.
Mm-hmm.
To make sure that the student feels like they have someone to talk to if that's something that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. Make sure the student is okay, because there is a power dynamic there, right? And depending on whether the student is an undergraduate or graduate, there might be policies at the university about consensual relationships. And there's actually debate whether with such a strong power dynamic, it actually is really a consensual relationship. But you also in this situation don't really know what happened, right? You don't want to necessarily assume that something happened, right? Exactly. Why is the assumption being made that a relationship was going on? Absolutely, that's a really good point. You don't know what happened here. This could be a case of the instructor taking advantage of the student without a relationship. But this also could be, the student might have needed something, right? And we can't assume that something inappropriate happened, right? But we do have to think about, what this looks like and make sure to other people on the camp, and also make sure that the student is okay, right? Like find out what the student needed and what the situation is here. Any other thoughts about this?
There is certainly the implication of favoritism, which affects everybody. And again, college policies should be in place on to deal with this.
Right, and that's again assuming there's a relationship potentially, right? Because the student might have gone into the tent unwillingly as well, and that's the challenge with talking about these scenarios too, is that there's such a strong power imbalance, and the student might have gone into the tent because maybe they had an emergency or something, right? And so you can think about, what are the rules in place if there's an emergency in the middle of the night and a student needs to get a hold of an instructor. How do you do that in a safe place so somebody doesn't have to come into somebody's sleeping quarters? Do you leave the tent door open? Do you meet outside the tent? Do you make sure there's other instructors as well, right? So there's lots of things, kind of rules you can have you ring a bell outside the tent and say, hey, I need to come in to talk to you about something. But what about in this scenario? What about if the male instructor was taking advantage of a student? What would you do in that situation?
I mean, again, in my current position as someone with tenure, I would confront them and talk to them about, hopefully there are policies in place that we had discussed before the trip, and tell them that I didn't think it was appropriate and that it was damaging the group and the student and that they needed to stop.
And so you would talk to the instructor in this situation?
In my role now, yes, as a faculty member with tenure. Yeah. If I were a student, I don't think I would feel comfortable doing that.
Yeah. But as a student, you could check in with the other student, right, and make sure that they were okay.
Yeah, definitely. You could do that no matter what level you were at.
Yeah. Okay. You would be legally required to notify your Title IX office. Yeah.
So Phoebe, this is Pranoti Asher. You made it was curious the way you started your comment. You said, because you're tenured, you felt comfortable doing this. So what if you were untenured? What would you think you would have done?
It would have depended on who the person was. If I was nervous that person was going to have a negative influence on my career, then I would have tried to find another person in the group who I could go to try to, get help. If that wasn't possible, if I was the only other faculty member on the trip, then I think I would still go to the person just because I would feel morally obligated to do so. But It would be a more difficult decision.
Mm. And another key here is, is there a reporting mechanism in place, right? And somebody brought up that they would be, legally required to notify their Title IX office. You would only be legally required to notify your Title IX office if something occurred, right? So the whole point here is, we need to check in with the student, right? Regardless of your position in the moment, checking in with the student, what harm is there in at least asking, them if they need any help and if everything's okay. And then, perhaps addressing the situation as well with the male instructor if the student is, unwilling or, not forthcoming about what occurred. I think that these things need to be brought to the forefront and that the instructor needs to be aware that this was noticed and that this behavior is not acceptable and not part of, the way to create an environment that makes everyone feel safe and comfortable and equal. Somebody brought up earlier, this could be viewed as favoritism, right? So even if there isn't something untoward happening, this could be viewed as favoritism, and that makes other students feel less included. And so, again, what are you striving for in your field environment? Well, how do you want everyone to feel? How do you want them to be included? And how do you make that the emphasis?
Yeah, and I'll also, this is a great discussion. I'll also add that, what if this is the only instructor on the field course? What if there's not another faculty on site who can talk to the instructor and everybody else is a student? Right, or what if the tent was out of a male student? Yeah. But what about if there's only one instructor on the field course? And that raises a challenge, right? If everybody else is a student, because of the power dynamics, nobody might feel comfortable saying anything. And so what's one easy way to prevent that situation from happening?
Well, to prevent it, I guess having rules against that kind of one-on-one, in closed quarters with the instructor, just as a rule. But I mean, if it's already happened, then I think, as a student, if you're not, the only thing that you really you can do, I think, given the power dynamic there, is to really make sure that that student is okay and that they're never in a situation where they are alone. If it is a situation where it's not okay and they're uncomfortable with whatever transpired, then you know, as a group, the rest of the students have to really be there to support that student and make sure it's not going to be a reoccurring thing, and then, you know, and then deal with it appropriately afterwards. I think would be the only way to go. You know, other than disrupt. Yeah, I don't see students, you know, going about disrupting the entire field course for something like that.
Yeah, and some people have some good suggestions is, you know, make sure there's not just one instructor on the field course, right? Make sure you have multiple faculty members or multiple instructors or multiple people in positions of power. So if one of them, you know, is committing inappropriate behavior, that, you know, there's someone else who can take over and who can deal with it. Yeah, here we go. Somebody said, I'm in a volunteer organization that works with youth. Firm rule, 2 adult members present for all activities. Someone to go if there's a problem. Absolutely. Imagine if there's a medical emergency, you know, do you have the student go on their own, or do you leave the rest of the team alone, right? So that's something to think about before you go into the field. And I know, you know, often a lot of field courses will have instructors that will kind of rotate, but don't always have 2 people on site. Or you might be in the field doing research, and you don't always have enough people on site. And that takes preparation, right? Because that takes extra funding and extra time. But definitely something to think about when preparing for these situations. You know, faculty need to undergo yearly training related to bullying and harassment to remind them of the kind of behavior that is expected. And absolutely, students should know ahead of time who or how to contact when they have concerns or encounter issues. All great suggestions. So we have about 10 minutes. Yeah, and students should also go under the same training. And so actually, you know, if you have a conversation with your students about field safety before you go into the field, you know, and students know what to happen if, you know, what to do if they twist their ankle or, you know, they have an allergic reaction to something. You know, why not have a conversation about field safety that includes harassment, bullying, other types of exclusionary behaviors that also can contribute to unsafe environments in the field? That should absolutely be part of it as well. So we have 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. I have one more scenario, which I'm happy to maybe spend a couple of minutes through, but I also want to make sure, you know, that people have time to ask questions. So I'm open for feedback. Well, maybe we have the next scenario is here. So let's do it. The research team has contracted a new crew to run the logistics of access to the field sites. The crew keep deferring to the oldest looking man in the research team, although the principal investigator is a woman of color. The members of the crew walked out of the field safety training during the component on sexual harassment and bystander intervention, which came after coordination of logistics and field safety. Discussion questions on the next slide. So what power dynamics are at play? What can the PI do? What about other research team members? What do you need to have in place to support those affected? What may be the consequences or risks of acting or not acting in this situation? And how could you prevent this from happening in the future? Open for discussion. So there's quite a few things going on in this scenario, right? Yeah, white male allies are really needed, right? And actually, even, you know, the oldest looking man in the research team in this situation might actually be able to play that role.
And a major challenge here too, right, is whether, you know, does the PI, you know, does she speak up for herself in a way that also might alienate, you know, the field crew, right? Because if she says, no, listen, I'm really, you know, the PI, and, you know, establishing her authority, but, you know, you want to do that in a way that makes everybody feel comfortable and confident, right? So I think I agree that I think having allies in this situation would also be really critical, right? That the whole entire research team feels that it's important that this be recognized and that the crew be listened to, but also that they be listened, that the research team and the PI be listened to.
Yeah, what might some of you do in this situation if you were the PI or if you're somebody else on the team? Okay, PI needs to make it clear that she's in charge without being offensive. If others have to do it, it belittles her status. Yeah. Yeah, and we've run this scenario, with people, and somebody in the room was like, well, this happened to me, and you know what? And I told my colleague, you deal with the crew. I don't want to deal with them, but everybody else on the team knows that I'm the PI, and I make the decisions, and you can convey them to the crew. And so that's one way to kind of deal with it in the moment as well. Yeah, so question of why is her job to not be offensive, or what does that even mean? Yeah, that's a really good question. And, some discussions here with this particular scenario is also thinking about, can you get rid of this crew and get a new crew, right? Or do you really depend on this crew? Like, does this crew run the helicopter that will get you out to your ice sheet to run your analyses? And if you can't use this crew, you can't do your research. What is the safety conditions as well? But okay, I've lost some of the thread of the discussion. Okay,
So there was a suggestion about, in the actual field safety training, that perhaps doing some of the training associated with sexual harassment and bullying behavior be moved first, so that people kind of have to participate. There was discussion of, again, creating allies amongst the team so that they're supportive of the PI directly, and that this is seen by the crew. Somebody brought up that this can be very more common in countries with a particular culture, a male-dominated culture. So having the people being addressed defer back to the PI is likely the best way to handle it if it's occurring out of country. So again, trying to sort of understand the cultural differences that might be applying there, but also helping the crew to recognize who's in charge and what dynamics are at play to make sure that everyone feels safe.
Yeah, and somebody also had the suggestion of, make sure the part on the training on sexual harassment and bystander intervention comes before the coordination of logistics and field safety, right? So they can't walk out; they need to be in the room. And absolutely document this, right? And if you have a choice not to work with the crew in the moment, then it's probably useful not to work with the crew, because if something were to happen in the field, right, they haven't actually been trained and they're not aware of all the policies in place. But sometimes the reality is that we might be stuck with the crew in the moment. But we can document this behavior and make sure that we don't use this crew in the future. And let funding agencies and other researchers know about this behavior as well. Here we go. They should not have been awarded the contract or job. Yeah, boils down to required training. And there's a lot of these things hopefully we can deal with beforehand and let them know that this is part of the required training. Okay, so why don't you move to the next slide, to the last slide, and then we'll open it up to questions. But I want to point you to our project resources, where you'll find more information on safety in the field, on inclusion, accessibility, building code of conduct, samples codes of conduct, more references and further reading if you want to learn more about research or read more about people's experiences in the field, and resources on building inclusive climates, and different types of trainings that are available for the community. There's a question. There's not universal agreement on when and how bystander intervention should be done. Absolutely. There's been quite a bit of research on how to effectively act as a bystander, and actually, we run trainings on bystander intervention as well, and have a whole range of ways that people can intervene, depending on people's kind of position in the power dynamics and safety. So there's a whole range of different ways people can intervene without putting themselves in danger. But yeah, that's a good point.